Humans need salt. This is a simple fact. Our bodies cannot work without it. Salt is sodium chloride. It is a mineral. It does many things inside us. It helps our nerves send messages. It makes our muscles move. It keeps our body fluids balanced. Without enough salt, our bodies fail. We get weak. We cramp up. Our organs stop working right. Eventually, a lack of salt can kill us. Think about early humans. They lived very differently. They hunted animals. They gathered plants. When they ate meat, they got some salt. Animal blood also contains salt, so people who ate a lot of meat might have gotten enough. But many early human diets were not just meat. As humans started to farm, they ate more plants. Plants have less salt than meat. This meant people needed to find salt from other places. Our bodies lose salt too. We sweat. When we work hard, we sweat a lot. When it is hot, we sweat even more. Early humans did a lot of hard work. They farmed, they built things, they walked long distances. They lived in many different climates. All this activity meant they lost a lot of salt. They had to replace it. Finding enough salt was a constant problem. It was a matter of life or death. Where could people find salt? It was not everywhere. Some places had salt mines. These were deep holes in the ground. People dug out salt rock. Other places had salt flats. These were areas where salty water evaporated. It left behind solid salt. Coastal areas also had salts. People could collect seawater. Then they would boil it down, or they would let the sun dry it out. This left pure salt. Natural salt springs also existed. Salty water came out of the ground. These sources were rare. They were not close to everyone. Getting salt was hard work. Mining salt was dangerous. It needed a lot of effort. Boiling seawater took a lot of fuel and time. Letting water evaporate needed the right climate. It also took time. This difficulty made salt even more valuable. It was not something you could just pick up anywhere. It was a resource that had to be found and processed. Every single person needed salt. It did not matter where they lived. It did not matter what they did. Rich or poor, young or old, everyone needed it to survive. This made salt universally valuable. Its worth was understood by everyone. There was no substitute for it. You could not use something else to replace the salt your body needed. This basic, unchanging need for survival was the first reason salt became so important. It laid the foundation for its value beyond just a food item. It was not a luxury. It was a necessity. People would go to great lengths to get it. They would trade for it. They would fight for it. Its importance was woven into the fabric of human existence from the very beginning. The human body is complex. It needs a balance of many things. Salt is key to this balance. When we talk about sodium, we are talking about a critical electrolyte. Electrolytes are like tiny batteries in our body. They carry electrical charges. These charges make our nerves fire. They make our heart beat. They make our muscles contract. Without enough sodium, these electrical signals get weak. Or they stop altogether. This is why a person can feel faint or get muscle cramps when they are low on salt. Think about a hot day. You are working hard, you are sweating a lot, your body is losing water. It is also losing salt. If you only drink plain water, you are diluting the remaining salt in your body. This can make the problem worse. It can lead to hyponatremia. This is when your sodium levels get too low. It is very dangerous. Early humans did not understand the science, but they knew the feeling. They knew that after intense work or in hot conditions, salt made them feel better. It restored their strength. It literally kept them alive. The early human diet was not always consistent. Food sources changed with seasons. Sometimes there was plenty, sometimes there was little. But the need for salt remained constant. Even in times of famine, salt was still needed. In fact, a weakened body might need it even more. This constant need, regardless of food supply, solidified its status as an unchanging essential. Consider the geography. Some regions were rich in salt. Coasts, arid deserts with salt pans, underground mines. Other regions had none. Inland areas away from seas and specific geological formations were barren of salt. This created a natural trade imbalance. People in salt-poor areas had to get it from salt-rich areas. This simple fact drove early commerce. It forced interaction between different groups of people. It made salt a primary item for exchange. The methods of obtaining salt also showed its value. In some places, people would gather brine, which is very salty water, from natural springs. They would then slowly evaporate the water, sometimes using the sun, sometimes using fire. This was a long, slow process. It consumed a lot of resources like wood for fires. This labor added to salt's cost, it added to its perceived value, it was not free. It always cost something, either effort or resources. So, salt was not just a flavoring. It was not a luxury item. It was a fundamental building block of human life. Without it, early societies could not thrive. They could barely survive. This deep, primal need made salt valuable in a way that few other things were. Its worth was not imagined. It was real. It was tied directly to life itself. This established its baseline as an incredibly important commodity. This importance went beyond simple food. It touched on health, survival, and the very structure of human communities. Its value was clear to everyone who sought to live and thrive. Salt was essential for life. But its value grew even more because of another critical use. This was food preservation. In ancient times, there was no refrigeration, there were no freezers, food spoiled quickly, meat rotted, fish went bad, vegetables withered. This was a huge problem for early societies. People could only eat what they caught or grew very recently. This meant constant hunting or harvesting. It meant that a good harvest could not feed people for long. Surplus food was often wasted. Salt changed this. It became the first great food preservative. It allowed people to store food for long periods. This changed everything. How did it work? Salt draws out moisture. It creates a very dry environment. Bacteria and other microbes need water to grow. Without water, they cannot multiply. Salt also interferes with their cell functions. So, salt makes food inhospitable to spoilage organisms. Think about salted meat. People would rub large amounts of salt into raw meat. They might also pack it in brine, a strong salt solution. This would draw out the water, it would cure the meat. The same was true for fish. Smoked and salted fish could last for months. Salted vegetables, like cabbage for sauerkraut, also became possible. This meant food could be kept through winter, it could last through dry seasons. It prevented starvation. It allowed people to plan for the future. This ability to preserve food had massive impacts. It allowed armies to march far from their homes. Soldiers needed food that would not spoil. Salted meat and fish provided that. Without it, armies would have had to live off the land. This limited their movements. It made them dependent on local supplies. Salted rations made them mobile and powerful. It also changed travel. Sailors could embark on long voyages. Their ships could carry barrels of salted meat and fish. This allowed them to cross oceans. Explorers could venture into unknown lands. They did not have to worry as much about finding food every single day. Salt made long-distance travel possible. It opened up new worlds. Trade also flourished because of salt preservation. Before salt, if you wanted to trade food, it had to be fresh. This limited trade to very short distances. But with salt, food could be transported over long distances. Fish caught on the coast could be salted and sent inland. Meat from herds could be processed and sent to cities. This created new trade routes. It allowed different regions to specialize. One region might produce grain, another might produce salt. They could trade their goods. This helped economies grow. Controlling salt sources also became a matter of national security. A nation with good access to salt could feed its army, it could feed its people in lean times. A nation without salt was vulnerable. Wars were fought over salt mines and salt springs. Control over salt production meant control over a key resource for survival and power. Beyond practical uses, salt sometimes held cultural and religious meaning. It was seen as pure. It was used in rituals, it was offered to gods. This added another layer to its value. It was not just useful, it was also sacred. This meant people respected it even more. The act of preserving food itself was labor-intensive. It took skill, it took time. This labor added to the overall value of preserved foods, and because salt was the key ingredient, it gave salt an even higher value. It was the ingredient that multiplied the value of other foods. Salt also had qualities that made it good for trade. It was durable. A block of salt did not go bad. It did not spoil. It held its value over time. It was also relatively consistent. A block of salt was generally similar to another block of salt. This made it a reliable commodity. You could trust its quality. These traits are important for anything that acts as money. It was something people understood, they knew its worth. This dual role as a survival necessity and as a transformative preservation agent cemented salt's status as one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. It was more than just a seasoning, it was a pillar of civilization. The ability to preserve food was a revolutionary step for humanity. It moved societies beyond a hand-to-mouth existence. Imagine a community living solely on fresh food. They would need to constantly forage, hunt, or harvest. Any surplus would quickly spoil. This means no long-term storage, no safety net. A bad harvest or a poor hunting season could mean mass starvation. Salt provided that safety net. It allowed people to build up reserves. It created stability. Consider the early farmers. They grew grain. Grain can be stored, but they also raised animals. Early meat from these animals needed to be eaten quickly, or it needed to be preserved. Salt made it possible to slaughter animals when they were ready, not just when meat was needed immediately. This meant farmers could manage their livestock better. They could make the most of their resources. For fishing communities, salt was equally vital. Fish catches can be huge one day and small the next. Salt allowed the excess catch to be saved. It could then be eaten later, or it could be traded inland. This smoothed out the peaks and valleys of food supply. It prevented gluts and shortages. This stability had a direct impact on population growth and settlement. People could live in larger groups. They could live in places that were not right next to their food source. Salt also played a role in food preparation. Beyond just preserving, it made some foods more palatable and enhanced flavors. This made meals more enjoyable. But its primary impact was on extending shelf life. Without this ability, many of the societal advancements we take for granted would have been impossible. Long-distance trade, large standing armies, and exploration all depended on reliable, non-perishable food supplies. Salt provided this. The demand for salt, therefore, was not just for sprinkling on food. It was for whole industries. It was for feeding entire populations. It was for equipping armies. It was for provisioning trade caravans and ships. This meant the amount of salt needed was vast. It was not a small personal amount. It was an industrial scale requirement even in ancient times. This high demand, coupled with its difficulty of extraction and limited sources, naturally made salt a very valuable commodity. Its value was not artificial. It was based on real, fundamental needs and capabilities. It was a tangible asset. People knew that if they had salt, they had a means to survive. They had a way to store wealth. They had something that others desperately wanted. This inherent value was critical for salt to transition into a form of currency. It was understood and accepted by everyone. Its utility was undeniable. For something to work as money, it needs certain qualities. It needs to be durable. It needs to be portable. It needs to be divisible. It needs to be uniform. It needs to be scarce, and it needs to be accepted by everyone. Salt, in its time, checked many of these boxes. This is why it became a form of currency. First, durability. Salt is a mineral. It does not rot. It does not spoil. A block of salt can last for years, even centuries. It keeps its value over time. This is important for money. You do not want your money to disappear or lose its worth just by sitting there. Salt was reliable in this way. Next, portability. Salt could be carried. It was often pressed into blocks or cakes. Sometimes it was carried in sacks. It could be heavy, yes, especially for large amounts. But for everyday transactions, it was manageable. Traders carried it on their backs. Animals carried it on caravans. It could be moved from one place to another. This allowed trade to happen over distances. Then, divisibility. You could break a large block of salt into smaller pieces. This meant you could use it for different values of goods or services. A whole block for a large purchase, a small piece for a smaller one. This made it flexible. It meant it could be used for many different kinds of transactions. Uniformity was also a factor. While the quality of salt might vary slightly, generally salt was salt. A block of good salt was similar to another block of good salt. This made it easy to value. People did not have to argue much about what a unit of salt was worth. It was more consistent than, say, a random animal hide or a basket of mixed produce. Scarcity was crucial. Salt was not everywhere. We talked about this, it was hard to get. This meant it was not so common that it lost its value. If everyone could easily get salt, it would not be valuable. But because it was rare in many places and hard to produce, its value stayed high. This controlled its supply. It maintained its worth. Finally, acceptability. This was perhaps the most important quality. Everyone needed salt for survival, for preserving food, so everyone would accept it in trade. If you offered someone salt for their goods, they knew they could use that salt. They could use it themselves or they could trade it to someone else. Its universal need made it universally accepted. So how is salt used in practice as currency? Imagine a farmer. He needs a new tool. He has no coins, but he has some extra salt he made or traded for. He goes to the blacksmith. He offers the blacksmith a block of salt for the tool. The blacksmith accepts. Why? Because the blacksmith also needs salt for his family, or he knows he can trade that salt to someone else for food or other things he needs. This was the basic barter system, but with salt as the common item of exchange. People paid workers in salt. They paid taxes in salt. In some places, salt blocks became the standard unit of payment. In ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which means salt money. It literally refers to the allowance given to Roman soldiers to buy salt. This shows how deeply salt was embedded in their economic system. And salt also acted as a store of wealth. If you had a good harvest, you might trade some grain for salt. You could store that salt. It would not spoil, it would hold its value. Later, when you needed something, you could use your stored salt to buy it. It was like a savings account. The famous Via Salaria or Salt Road in ancient Rome shows salt's importance. This was a road built specifically to transport salt from the salt pans at Ostia near the coast, inland to Rome and beyond. It literally facilitated the movement of this critical currency. It was a testament to the value of salt. People trusted salt, they trusted its value, because its value was inherent, it was tied to their very lives. This trust is essential for any currency. If people do not trust that their money will be worth something tomorrow, they will not use it. Salt had that trust. Of course, salt currency was not perfect. Its weight and bulk could be a problem for very large transactions. Carrying huge amounts of salt was difficult, but for the scale of most daily trade in ancient times, it worked well. It was a tangible, essential commodity that served as a reliable medium of exchange for centuries. It smoothed out the roughness of pure barter. It allowed complex economies to begin to form. It literally helped build empires and support populations. The practical application of salt as currency varied by region. In some places, like parts of Africa, specific shapes of salt were molded and used. These amels, in Ethiopia for example, were carefully cut salt blocks. They had a standard size and weight. This made them even more like coins. They were easy to recognize, their value was understood. This kind of standardization helped to make trade even more efficient. Think about the sheer simplicity of it. You need something. The other person needs salt. It's a direct exchange. No complex calculations were needed for its value. Everyone knew what salt was for. Everyone knew its worth. This made it very accessible as a form of money, even for people who might not have understood abstract economic concepts. It was real. It was tangible. The ability to use salt as money meant that people didn't have to carry around a wide variety of goods for barter. Instead, they could carry salt. This streamlined trade significantly. If a hunter wanted to trade furs for tools, he didn't need to guess if the toolmaker wanted furs. He could offer salt, knowing the toolmaker would accept it. This universality made trade flow much more smoothly. This function as a currency extended beyond simply buying goods. It was used to pay tribute. Conquered peoples might have been required to pay a certain amount of salt to their overlords. This made salt a tool of power and control. It demonstrated its high value in the eyes of rulers as well. It was a stable and consistent source of revenue for states. The stability of salt's value was also important. Unlike some other commodities, its value didn't fluctuate wildly with the seasons or with local supply gluts. While new discoveries of salt sources or improved transportation could affect its long-term value, day to day its worth was relatively constant because the human need for it was constant. This predictability made it a reliable store of value and a trusted medium of exchange. It was, for a long time, the rock-solid foundation of many ancient economies. Salt currency was not just a theoretical idea. It was a real part of history. Many civilizations used it. The impact was widespread and long-lasting. One of the most famous examples comes from ancient Rome. Roman soldiers were very important. They guarded the empire, they fought its wars, they needed to be paid. Part of their payment was often in salt, or it was an allowance to buy salt. This payment was called salarium. This is where our modern word salary comes from. It is a direct link to salt's role as money. It shows how fundamental salt was to keeping the Roman army strong and the empire running. In ancient China, salt was also incredibly important. The state understood its value very early on. They often set up government monopolies on salt. This meant only the government could produce or sell it. Why? Because it was a huge source of revenue. The government collected massive taxes on salt. This wealth helped fund the state. It paid for armies. It built infrastructure. The control of salt became a key part of imperial power in China. It allowed the central government to exert control and collect wealth from its vast territories. Across Africa, especially in the Sahara Desert region, salt slabs were a distinct form of currency. These were often carefully cut and shaped blocks of salt. They were used for trade along ancient caravan routes. In Ethiopia, there was a specific salt currency called the amol. These were long, heavy bars of salt. They were cut from salt flats, they were a standard size, people traded them for goods like gold, ivory, and other commodities. Caravans would carry these salt bars across the desert. It was a vital part of the trans-Saharan trade network. This network linked very different cultures. It was all built on the trade of salt. In medieval Europe, salt was a major trade item. Cities that controlled salt production or trade routes became very powerful. Venice, for example, grew rich and powerful, partly because it controlled salt production and distribution in the Mediterranean. It established salt monopolies in its territories, it collected tariffs on salt trade. This wealth funded its navy, it built its grand buildings, it made Venice a major power for centuries. Specific locations became famous for their salt. Salt mines in places like Hallstatt, Austria, and Wieliczka, Poland, were incredibly valuable. These mines were worked for thousands of years. They were centers of wealth and trade. People would travel long distances to get salt from these sources. These places became major economic hubs. Their names often reflect salt, like Salzburg in Austria, Salt Castle. In pre-Columbian Americas, salt was also used in trade. The Maya and Aztec civilizations understood its importance. They traded salt from coastal areas to inland regions. Salt was a key commodity that tied together different parts of their empires and trade networks. It was essential for both survival and for preserving food for their large populations. The politics of salt were often fierce. Control over salt sources meant power. Nations went to war to secure access to salt. Empires rose and fell based on their ability to control this vital resource. A ruler who controlled salt could feed his people and his army. He could also tax his people and grow rich. This made salt a strategic asset. Government monopolies on salt were common. They were a simple and effective way for states to generate revenue. The gabelle in pre-revolutionary France was a famous and hated salt tax. It led to widespread smuggling and even contributed to social unrest. This shows just how deeply salt was tied to the economic and political life of a nation. Salt also influenced where people settled. Early communities often grew up near salt sources. These locations offered a vital resource. Trade routes naturally formed to connect salt-producing areas with salt-consuming areas. This shaped the geography of human settlement and trade for millennia. The use of salt as currency allowed for more diverse economies to develop. If people could trade their specialized goods for salt, they didn't have to be self-sufficient in everything. A weaver could make cloth and trade it for salt, then use the salt to buy food from a farmer. This specialization made societies more productive and efficient. It moved them beyond simple subsistence. Salt's impact was truly global. From the Roman legions to Chinese emperors, from African traders to European merchants, salt was a cornerstone of economic life. It was a tangible universal medium of exchange that allowed societies to grow, trade, and thrive. Its story is woven into the very fabric of human history. It literally built roads, funded armies, and shaped the destinies of empires. It provided a clear example of how a fundamental need could also become the engine of an economy. The Roman salarium is a powerful reminder. It shows how directly a basic commodity could function as money. Roman soldiers were not just being paid an abstract coin, they were getting something that directly supported their lives. This made the payment real and understandable. It was a tangible benefit. This practice continued for a long time. It highlights that the most effective early currencies were those with inherent, easily understood value. Salt fit this perfectly. Consider the vast distances involved in the trans-Saharan trade. Caravans of camels would travel for months. They carried heavy loads. What were they carrying? Gold, ivory, and crucially, salt. The salt was often coming from salt mines in the middle of the desert, like Tagaza. It was then traded south for gold. This shows the incredible value placed on salt in regions where it was scarce. Literally worth its weight in gold in some places. This kind of long-distance trade would have been impossible without a medium of exchange that was universally accepted and held its value over long journeys. The control of salt also gave rise to powerful merchant classes. These individuals or families controlled the production, transportation, and sale of salt. They amassed great wealth and influence. They became key players in the economic and political landscape of their regions. Their power was directly tied to their control of this essential resource. This created entire economic systems built around salt. Even the everyday person understood the value of salt. A small amount of salt could buy a meal. A larger amount could buy a tool or a garment. This common understanding made it a very effective form of money. There was no confusion. No complex banking systems were needed. The value was self-evident. This simplicity was one of its strengths as a currency. It made transactions easy and transparent in a world without complex financial instruments. The historical examples show that salt wasn't just sometimes used as currency, it was a major economic driver for centuries in various parts of the world. It was a foundational element of early trade and governance. It shaped migration patterns. It defined power struggles. It built fortunes. The story of salt as currency is truly the story of human economic evolution and the quest for survival and prosperity. Salt was a dominant currency for a long time, but like all currencies, its time eventually passed. Several factors led to its decline as money. It did not happen overnight. It was a gradual shift. One big reason was increased production. As human technology improved, people found new ways to get salt. New salt mines were discovered, better mining techniques emerged, more efficient ways to evaporate seawater or brine were developed. This meant salt became less scarce. When something becomes less scarce, its value tends to go down. It was still important, but it was no longer as rare or as hard to get as it once was. Another factor was better transportation. Roads improved, canals were dug, ships became larger and more efficient. This made it easier to move salt from where it was plentiful to where it was scarce. Before, a region far from a salt source would pay a high price for salt, but with better transportation, salt could be brought there more cheaply. This reduced its regional value. The price difference between salt-rich and salt-poor areas became smaller. This meant salt was not as valuable everywhere. The rise of standardized metallic currency also played a huge role. Coins, usually made of gold, silver, or copper, had many advantages over salt. They were much more portable. Like, you could carry a lot of value in a small, light coin. Imagine carrying a bag of coins versus a heavy block of salt. Their coins were also perfectly divisible. You could have coins for very small amounts and coins for very large amounts. They were uniform. A coin of a certain weight and metal had a precise, agreed upon value. This made transactions much faster and simpler. Governments also started to take more control over currency. They began minting their own coins. They enforced their use. This moved economies away from commodity money like salt towards representative money. Representative money, like coins or paper money, does not have its own intrinsic value. A piece of paper money is just paper, but it represents a certain value. The government guarantees its worth. This shift helped centralize economic power. It made it easier for governments to manage their economies. Salt remained vital, but its role changed. It was still essential for food preservation. It was still used for seasoning. It found new uses in industry, like tanning leather or making chemicals. But it lost its function as a general medium of exchange. It became a commodity like grain or wood. It was traded for money, but it was no longer money itself. The legacy of salt currency still exists. The word salary is a constant reminder. Many place names like Salzburg in Austria or Salzgitter in Germany speak to the historical importance of salt in those areas. These names show how fundamental salt was to their development and wealth. The story of salt as currency teaches us something important about money itself. What makes good currency can change over time. What is scarce and valuable in one era might become common and less valuable in another. Early currencies were often things with intrinsic value, things people needed to survive. Gold and silver had intrinsic value but also portability and beauty. Salt had intrinsic value because it kept you alive. The journey of salt is a fascinating one. It started as a basic, life-sustaining mineral. It became a powerful tool for preserving food. This led to its use as a universal currency. Then, as societies evolved and technologies advanced, it shifted back to being a common, though still essential, commodity. This transition highlights how human economies adapt. As needs change and as resources become more accessible, the way we value and exchange things changes too. Salt's story shows how deeply our economic systems are tied to our most fundamental needs. It reminds us that even the simplest things can drive complex civilizations. And while we no longer pay our bills with salt, its historical role as money shaped the world we live in today. It was a silent, unsung hero of early commerce, laying the groundwork for the more abstract monetary systems we use now. The move from salt to metallic currency was a step towards abstraction. A salt block was food. You could eat it or preserve with it. Its value was directly connected to its use. A gold coin, while valuable, was less directly useful in daily survival. You couldn't eat it. This shift reflects a growing trust in societal systems. People trusted that the gold coin would be accepted because the government or a powerful entity backed its value. This was a more complex system than simply trading one universally needed item for another. The invention of more efficient mining and transportation methods essentially democratized salt. It made it available to more people at a lower cost. This was good for public health and food security, but it undercut its value as a scarce, premium commodity that could serve as currency. As salt became easier to get, its premium price eroded. The very success of salt as a commodity ultimately led to its downfall as a currency. Its widespread demand drove innovation in its production and distribution. These innovations, in turn, made it too common to function as a highly valued form of money. It became readily available. Money needs a certain level of controlled scarcity to maintain its value and prevent inflation. When salt became too abundant, it lost that critical aspect. So, while salt is still an indispensable part of our lives today, its reign as a form of currency is long over. But its story is a powerful illustration of economic principles at work. It shows how intrinsic utility, scarcity, and universal acceptance can turn a basic commodity into the lifeblood of an economy, and how changes in those factors can lead to its eventual replacement by more efficient, standardized forms of money. The echoes of salt's ancient power can still be heard in our language and seen in our historical landscapes. It truly paved the way for modern economic thought and practice. It was a foundational element in moving humanity from simple barter to complex trade. The shift was not just about convenience or availability, it was also about the evolving role of the state. As governments became more organized and powerful, they sought to control the economy. Minting coins and then issuing paper money gave them that control. They could standardize currency across their territories. They could regulate its supply. This was much harder to do with a physical commodity like salt, which could be produced and traded by anyone with access to sources. The decline of salt as currency is part of a larger story of states solidifying their economic power and moving towards centralized monetary systems. It marks a transition to a more sophisticated, though often more abstract, way of valuing goods and services. Salt's time as direct money ended, but its essential role in human life continues.